Hello, this is Dean Radin, and I'm on Your Superior Self.
Hi, I'm Anita Murjani, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hello, this is Dr. Raymond Moody, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hi, Cultural Creatives. I'm Bruce Lipton, and I'm here to join you with Your Superior Self.
This is Paul Selig, and this is Your Superior Self.
What's up, everybody? I'm Aubrey Marcus, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hey, everybody. I am Anoop Kumar, and this is Your Superior Self.
So savvy, like just coming in like with that strong voice that I couldn't do that. I mean, when I try to introduce my guest, I'm just kind of like, "What's up, man? What's going on?" You're like, "Yeah, this is Anoop Kumar, MD." I love that, dude. Thank you for taking the time.
Smoky voice mode.
I know. Thank you for taking the time. I'm very excited about this conversation. I've been watching a lot of your material and content, and I'm excited to talk about consciousness, the mind, and just healing in general. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Let's man, I wish I hit record before we started talking. Because I don't know if we can ever relive that moment of just beautiful storytelling, but give some audience members here like some context about you and like your upbringing and your moment of intense awareness or enlightenment.
So upbringing, I was born in Washington, D.C., not far from where I am now. And my family moved back to Kerala in South India shortly after I was born, not sure exactly when. And we lived there for several years. My father was a professor of biochemistry, and we lived in a couple different places in South India, and then came back to Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C., when I was almost 6 years old. And so my first memories are from India, from the villages of India, and running around bare feet outside and in the rain, and mangoes and jackfruits and coconuts and bananas, and all this. We had a couple cows and all this kind of stuff, which to me is kind of a romantic picture. It wasn't so romantic for my grandmother, who was working her butt off, and then coming back here, definitely notice a difference. It was exciting. I remember seeing when my father had come back earlier than we did to the US, just to kind of get the apartment and get things set up for us to come. And so when he picked us up from Dulles Airport, we were driving down, I guess it was 495. And I guess seatbelts weren't a thing back then. I don't remember. I was in the front seat, like 5 years old, like leaning into the windshield, staring outside. And I still remember the painted lanes, like these pristine, beautiful painted lanes, and the lights. And it's like, oh, it's an amazing kind of place. And then I started to see this kind of difference, which I hadn't really told myself that story of what it is, but I started to see the difference between like the village of India and, suburban Washington, D.C. And soon after that, around elementary school, my parents became very interested in ancient Indian philosophy, the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta. And we were immersed in it, essentially. So we were studying it, we were attending classes, we were around the monks who were practicing it. And that was, in many ways, the most significant aspect of my upbringing, in the sense that it was deep philosophy. And I think all children have the ability to understand deep philosophy. They kind of intuit the deep philosophy, right? Before, as long as you don't get all the other concepts laden on top of your experience of life. So that was fortunate to have that experience. And then so all my school learning was actually overlaid on top of that, as opposed to the other way around, which it happens a lot. So that was a lot of my upbringing. So everything I was learning in school, it was always being kind of put side by side with what I was learning at home. And there was always this kind of trying to reconcile these things, because I didn't feel like they would actually be contradictory. Sometimes it felt contradictory, And I had a sense that it might appear so, but it can't actually be contradictory, because it's like what is true and kind of appears in different ways, was the kind of feeling. So that was a lot of my childhood, along with all the other stuff that any child would do. And that was kind of the background to leading up to medical school, and ultimately doing what I'm doing now, which is communicating about a subtler nature of being human and what that has to do with healing.
Mm. Mm. I can just 1,000 questions pop in my mind right now. So you work in the emergency room now, correct?
Yes.
You've been doing that for like 15 years, and you talk a lot about philosophy. You talk a lot about consciousness. You talk about the mind. At what point in your career did you decide that you wanted to go this route and start being more open, or not, maybe not open, but like start having a podcast, start, communicating these concepts with people?
The communicating the concepts, honestly, in residency, in my training. I trained from 2007, started my training. And I was starting to explore at that time, what stuff was, like, what was social media, and, went through many iterations of what is now Health Revolution, started as Wellness Emergence, and then Health Emergence, like all these names. And I was writing down thoughts about health and healing and well-being and mind. And some of my supervisors just thought it was nuts. Some of my supervisors in my training, sometimes they would get frustrated. Oh, can't you just write about diabetes? Can't you just write about something else? But that was my interest. I was interested in the health system overall. And then, specifically, I wasn't talking too much about mind and consciousness at that time, because I just didn't have the language. It was too much. And I hadn't yet developed the skill of putting it into a current of thought that someone can follow along with me. So it was more health, wellness, well-being, healthcare reform. It was more in that kind of space, and then started to, over time, dip into mind, consciousness, nature of reality, and how that connects with healing.
Your experience with your unique, I don't know if it's a near-death experience, or if you want to call it a peak experience, like Maslow calls a peak experience. Did that have a lot of influence on you talking about consciousness or not?
It did, because it gave this sense of confidence in speaking about it, because it wasn't somebody else's knowledge. It wasn't a teacher's knowledge. It wasn't a book's knowledge. It wasn't somebody's story. I'm basically telling my story, and I'm trying to tell it in a way that other people can recognize themselves, because I don't think it's a story unique to me. I think everybody experiences this in different ways to different extents. And I think if people kind of, put down what's on their mind right now, put down what they're holding in their hand right now, and pause and listen, I think they will feel aspects of their own story. So that's always been there. And that really crystallized after that, what people might call a peak experience.
Your podcast, it's the title of it. Is this a dream? Is that what it?
The book is This a Dream? The second book I wrote. The podcast is called Healing is Possible.
So is this a dream? Going back, I haven't read the book yet. I can't wait to get my hands on it. I'm just going to ask you, is this a dream?
So that's why the book is this a dream ? And not this is a dream, period. Right? It's intentionally left that way because, in a way, the question itself is an answer, right? So if we can pause for a moment and consider that the answer is this a dream? And the space into which the question takes you, the exploratory space into which this question can take the mind, is the hallway of the answer. Let's put it that way. So in other words, if I say this is a dream or this is not a dream, it's not as useful, I feel, as if I say, yeah, is this a dream? And then we go on that exploration together, right? One of the things we can say is that within a dream, the characters experience the world as physical, right? In the dream world is not a dream world. In the dream, what we call a dream world is a physical world, for sure, with absolute certainty, right? You can have a healthcare system within that dream in which they recognize a physical body, and there's no randomized controlled trial in the world within that dream that can tell anybody that the body is not physical, because we've already defined it as such and we experience it as such. So the question of physical versus mental is not a scientific question. It's more of a philosophical and experiential question. And so within the dream, if we kind of transpose our world culture now into a dream, we would say that the dream is physical. Now, if there are two characters walking side by side within a dream, Anoop and Trey having a conversation, and then Anoop might say, hey, Trey, I read this crazy book and it talks about how we're made up of these small parts. My hand is made up of cells, which are made up of molecules, which are made of atoms, which are made of subatomic particles. And then Trey, this really weird thing happens. I don't know. We didn't learn about it in medical school, but this weird thing happens when you go beyond the level of elementary particles. What we think to be these small little balls are actually vibrations in non-local fields of energy. And I don't know what that means. I don't know what it has to do with medicine, but I don't really know. But it's really weird. Trey says, really? So these little tiny things that our body is made of, you're saying it's kind of like patterns within fields of energy. That sounds like woo. That sounds like quantum woo. That sounds like spirituality. I just don't, it doesn't quite make sense. How can every small thing that even this brick house in front of us is made of, remember this is all within the dream, how can that be just like patterns of energy or a vibration of energy? Isn't that a small, tiny thing? And of course, you and I now sitting outside of it, we've woken up now and we're sitting here in the waking state and we're having a conversation. We can start to piece some of that together. We're not physicists. We don't have to be into spirituality. Just by looking at that dream, we can start to piece together, well, we know why those characters thought, or why those really intrepid and diligent scientists who were looking into the nature of things in that dream, we know now, despite being non-experts in a sense ourselves, we know why they were saying that every little dot, every little particle, every little mote of dust that made up that brick wall in the dream, we know why they're saying it's a pattern in a huge non-local field. Because from here, we know what that dream was made of. It was made of mind. The brick wall in the dream was exactly that. It was a local pattern in a non-local field that we call mind, or consciousness, or whatever term we want to use. Right? So I'm saying all this to suggest that this question, is this a dream, is an exploration. And the gratifying aspect and the peace-giving, insight-giving, wonder-giving aspect of it is the exploration. And then whether we say yes or no depends on how we define a dream. Does there have to be continuity in a dream from one episode to the next? And all these kinds of things come into play.
I love that metaphor. I just you said that before in an interview, how your dream, that is the mind, and like we feel like it's so real, and then we come back to here and then we're like, oh, that was just a dream, but it was the mind. But we were in that dream, it felt real as this does to us. And now, like, if we were to awaken from this and this was a dream, we just don't have the capacity to see outside of it yet, right? But you talk about the three different minds, the 1, 2, and 3 mind. Is this your model of kind of stepping back and seeing horizon and realizing the dream and getting outside of this narrow drama and being able to look back at a wider screen and say, all right, maybe this is a dream?
Yeah, going back to a real, hopefully, I think we're arriving in a place now in the progression of spirituality and science, hopefully, where I think the word real for this kind of conversation is perhaps not needed. I think we can talk about a dream is real when we're experiencing it. And it's perhaps not so real when we're not. But even when we're not experiencing a dream, it still has a reality that influences. We can learn in dreams, right? We can have intense emotional experiences in dreams, and that reality stays with us, because even that dream and this experience we're having now is mental experience. So the mind is common to both. So, whether the picture and the image was real or not, I'm not sure how significant that is. That it's the meaning is real. The experience that we are experiencing it is real. And same thing here, that we're experiencing this is real. The question is more of, is the experience useful? Is it meaningful? Is it relevant? Are we using it responsibly in our lives? I think these are the relevant questions more than real. And then to go back, what was the question you asked?
Well, just hit on, I guess, the first mind, second mind, third mind model.
Yeah. So the first mind, so the overall, you asked initially about the overall model. Yeah, the overall model is to simply describe a wider swath of reality, right? There's more to the experience of life than we are taught in schools. And we know that school is just one part of our education. But what can often happen in a society is we say that what we're taught in school is real knowledge or true knowledge, and everything else is secondary. And that's not true. The educational system has a certain philosophy associated with it, though we don't talk about it in terms of philosophy, but they teach a philosophy, largely of a physicalist or materialist philosophy. And it's implicitly taught. And then they teach a certain kind of thinking for the most part. And all of these are useful, but they are not the only way of seeing the world. And that's the key. And so if you look at all the wisdom traditions, philosophical traditions, and of course, the modern education system, all of these are different lenses, different ways of seeing what's happening. And so the three minds is a way of describing that, so that if we have a story such as the three minds that describes a much broader range of reality, then we can allow ourselves also to experience that and to say that, oh, okay, this is another way of experiencing. This is okay. This isn't strange because my only lens is not lens A. If lens A is the only allowed lens, then what I'm experiencing is strange and not allowed, and I shouldn't talk about it, etc. Right? But if lens A, B, C, D, E are all valid ways of knowing, of experiencing, of being, of learning, of growing, then, oh, there's so much actually more to what I am and what this world is. And it's kind of cool to experience in these ways. So that's the idea of the three minds. The first mind is the standard view in society, which is that of localized identity, meaning that what I am is felt to be this distinct thing. And that this distinct thing can be any particular thing. It can be this body. I am this body. This is what I am. Everything that is not this is not me. It's not an intellectual sense, by the way. We're describing it in words, but it's not an intellectual sense. It's simply a felt sense. It's an experienced sense, right? That what I am is this body. It's here and it's not over there. It can also be this personality. What I am is this personality, right? So it's defined by what I like, what I don't like, who I want to be, who I am not, all of these. This defines what I am, the sense of personality. So that is more subtle because the boundary is not, as we say, physical, meaning it's not a shared perception like the body. It tends to be more of a private perception, a private feeling, except for the people that really know us, the personality. So it's a more subtle boundary. Nonetheless, it's a very distinct boundary, such that if somebody sees us after several years, they might say, oh, you've changed. Even if physically you might appear the same, you've changed. Your likes have changed, your dislikes have changed. Not the same person, right? So that sense of identity. So these distinct senses of identity, of me, not me, that's the first mind condition of experience. And what the three minds framework suggests, first of all, I should say that the hypothesis here is that the world fundamentally is not an external independent thing, but that the world is essentially an experience of consciousness and an experience in consciousness. And what I mean by that simply is, it's easily understood if you look at the dream, right? We have a dreamer who divides themselves up, who differentiates like cell lines, right? You have a stem cell that divides into red blood cell, white blood cell, all the different cells. Similarly, you have one mind that differentiates into the protagonist and the antagonist, the friend and the enemy, right? Into different timelines, to different experiences, different, what we might call planets, right? What sci-fi and spirituality might call different dimensions, right? In a dream, it's very clear, us having woken up from the dream, it's very clear for us to say, well, that's really the dreamer's mind. That's a mind that's showing up as all those characters in that dream: the aging, the health, the disease, the death, the horror, the jubilation, everything, right? And it even appears as space and time, because we know that in a dream, you can experience a decade in what's probably a couple minutes of outside time, so to speak, right? So even the sense of space and time, and in a dream, you can travel across the galaxy in a jiffy, right? As soon as you even intend, you're already there. So everything, including the construct and experience and expansiveness and linearity and progression of space and time, are part of that dreaming mind. So this is the hypothesis here in the three minds framework, is that consciousness is fundamental. And this can be a very confusing statement because of how we think about consciousness. But here, consciousness is not just Anoop Sartre's consciousness. We're talking about consciousness as a non-localized phenomenon, as an unrestricted phenomenon, not being the result of a brain or the result of a body or the result of a thing that is alive or dead. It is simply fundamental. We're saying what we call the world is consciousness. And that then partitions itself, differentiates within itself, and appears as this scene that we're experiencing. So that's the hypothesis. So what does the first mind view say? It says that we experience the world then as me, this thing, this body, this personality, and not me, which is, the things around me, the camera that I'm looking at right now, right? The face of Trey that I'm looking at right now, all that's not me. And this sense that exists of identity as being this particular thing necessitates that there's a boundary around identity, right? How do we describe anything with particularity? How do we point out anything? It's only because there's a boundary around it. I can say that car over there because we can see the outline of the car, right? I can say that desk because we can see the outline of, there's a boundary. And the idea here from the first mind view is that the reason we see a world of distinctness, hypothesizing again that the world is essentially of the nature of consciousness, non-local, undifferentiated consciousness, then why do we perceive all this multiplicity? And the reason being that when one's own sense of identity is localized and constricted within a boundary, then that same sense is superimposed on this canvas of consciousness. And therefore, we see a world of restrictions and boundaries, and that's what we call things, right? This is the model of scarcity, that everything is finite. And although there are infinite numbers of things, we're always creating things, but all things are finite in and of themselves, right? Why? The three minds hypothesis is that because I myself experience myself as finite and distinct, therefore I see a world of distinct multiplicity. Now, it's key to understand that we're not saying that boundaries are unimportant. We're not saying that limitations or distinctness is not important. We need distinctness. There's no conversation happening here without distinctness, without boundary. There's a boundary around every concept that I'm saying. That's why it can make any sense at all, as opposed to spreading out into nonverbal silence, right? To use a word, I need a concept. To use a concept, there has to be a boundary around what it entails. So boundaries are useful, but they are superimposed. That's the lesson of the first mind view. So boundaries can be perceived, but if you dive into any boundary, you'll see that it's a perceptual boundary, it's an experience boundary, it's not fundamental. The boundary of this hand is clearly seen, but if you ask what makes up the boundary of this finger, we'll say it's a line of cells. But if you zoom into that line of cells, you'll see that the boundary is actually not a straight line like we see here. And it'll be rough and bumpy. And you say, well, what's the boundary of those line of cells? You say, well, those are actually molecules. Well, what's the boundary of those molecules? Well, they're atoms. And you go on until you reach that dream example where it becomes non-local fields of energy. So what is the boundary actually made of here? It's superimposed, it's experienced. And the hypothesis here is that it's experienced to the degree that the sense of identity is localized. This is the first mind view. The second mind view is that when the sense of identity then delocalizes, when it is no longer constricted and boundarized as this body, this personality, this tendency, this lifetime, when that sense of boundary delocalizes, then what we call the world itself is seen and experienced differently. And to the extent that that boundary delocalizes, the boundaries of what is experienced as the world also delocalizes. And so from this view, what we call objects are something more akin to thoughts, right? And what we call space and time is the experience of changing thoughts, right? Something, I'm using the language loosely here. So in other words, that fundamental division between me and you is not fundamental. It's superimposed and functional. The difference between this and that, we use these words so casually, this and that, but think about what they mean. This means it's close to me, right? We won't say, this car, so you and I are on the East Coast of the United States. We wouldn't say, this car in California and that car here right next to me. We would never say that, right? We would say that car in California and this car next to me. Why? Because this indicates closeness to me. And what is me? It's the sense of identity, right? So when that sense of identity broadens or loosens, then that division relaxes. And everything is a kind of this. So this is the second mind view. An even more powerful one is here and there. The definition of here is where the sense of identity is. Where I am is here. Where I am not is there. Right? And what is that? That's space. Right? The difference between here and there is what we experience as space. 2 points are needed to define space, here and there. And when those points are established in our awareness, we experience space, the span of space. And if those 2 points merge, right? In mathematics, a point does not take up any space. So if those 2 points merge, there cannot be space anymore. Where here and there, if one of them disappears, then it's just 1 point or no point. So the second mind view is that view where identity ranges to the unbounded. And to the extent that it ranges, the world is also experienced as fundamentally non-physical. Whatever that word physical means, I still don't know what it means. I haven't gotten a good definition for it. But we tend to say it's physical, is related to the body. But then if you do a dream analysis, that definition really doesn't hold. So that's the second mind view. The third mind view is that of pure potential, right? So in the second mind range, the second mind is a range of identity, going from partially localized to delocalized. And accordingly, the world and space and time are perceived as such. And the third mind is simply the potential state prior to perception, prior to experience, prior to the fluctuations of mind and mentality and physicality and such. So these are three views of one and the same reality, right? So we're not saying that the world is not this, it is only that. No, the world is all of this. And it just depends at which level we access it, through which lens we access what is here, right? It's almost like racehorses that have blinders, they see just like this, right? And the idea is to keep them going in this direction, right? So a first mind view, in a way, is a very focal view of what the world is. Another example is sunglasses. If I wear sunglasses that are tinted pink, then the world is pink. You can't say the world is not pink. You can only say the world is not pink if you've ever taken off your pink sunglasses. But if everybody's wearing pink sunglasses, the world is pink. That's a fact in this world, right? And then we can say there's another view in which actually the world is amazing color, all kinds of ranges of colors. It's just mind-boggling, right? But does that mean the first view is false? It doesn't really mean it's false. It just means that that was the view from that perspective. And here's another perspective, that's the view. Here's another perspective, that's the view. So this three minds framework is an opportunity to consider another hypothesis about what this world is, what life is, and hopefully have a little bit of fun and see how it's reflected in all the fields. Like this is top of mind in neuroscience and AI and virtual reality and medicine and healing. The implications of this are showing up in every field, at the leading edge of every field.
Yeah, I love all of that. I don't know if you listen to Tom Campbell at all, Thomas A. Campbell.
I've heard some of his stuff, yeah.
His model of consciousness, consciousness is fundamental of this virtual reality, like The Sims, right? Like this is the avatar. The computer is not actually in this reality, right? Like, so there's a non-physical reality out there that has the player and the computer, and inside here is just the avatar.
I would just say, with that, I'm a little careful there to not describe it too much like VR or avatars in the computer, although I think that's a good learning model to consider. What I don't choose about that model is it tends to give the idea that this is not real. And that's an idea that I don't support, that this is not real. I say, this is what it is. This is as it is. This is the reality from one view. And there are other views of this reality. So it's not to diminish the importance of this reality. In this reality, we have a lot of work to do, right? That's why I'm talking about healing in the context of healthcare, for example. Somebody else is talking about physics, somebody else is talking about whatever they choose to talk about. So there's a lot of work to do in this, through this view of the world, and it's important work. And so we can, and that's exactly why the book is also called Is This a Dream? Not just This Is a Dream.
Mhm.
Because to some extent, it doesn't matter. Once the view opens up, it's like waves in the ocean, right? Nobody's going to say, well, this is the good wave. That wave isn't good. It's like they all kind of, complement each other.
Sure. Speaking of healing, right? What's the mind's relationship to healing? Is it the mind healing, or is it the belief?
So it depends on the view that we take. From the first mind perspective, what we say is there's the body and the brain creates the mind, right? And then we start to wonder, what is the connection between the mind body? And so we talk about mind body connection, mind body medicine, and we're all trying to figure out what the connection is between the mind and the body, or the mind and the brain. So from that perspective, we talk about stress relief, right? So relaxing that mind has an effect on the body, because the body, the hormones in the body, the blood pressure, the heart rate, all of this is relative to the state of the mind. So that's one of the mechanisms we have to act on the body, is by changing that first mind, the stress response, for example, relaxing, meditation, all of these things. From a slightly deeper perspective, we can see that which is stored in the mind represents itself as the body. So it's not just, a very simplistic happy mind, happy body kind of idea, but things that are stored in the mind, emotions, thoughts, ideas, could be from decades ago. What are stored in the mind actually represent themselves physically. It could be a tension, right? It could be a tension in the lower back. It could be stomach ulcer. It could be intestinal problems. It could be, problems with certain behaviors or getting things done. There are all kinds of things where we can say that, okay, the mind is not just my thoughts and my feelings that are there, and I should feel nice and then my body will relax, but maybe it's something more fundamental. Maybe the mind itself is representing itself through the body. This is what at Health Revolution, we call this mind-body flow theory, which is theorizing that which we call the body is actually the flow of the mind. Just like a river is the flow of water, right? And if you want the river to be different, then you change the water, the river changes. And that's how we see the body, that the body is the representation of the mind. Now, when we say it this way, it really expands our understanding of the mind, because it's not simply about belief. It's not that, okay, I believe I don't have this disease and therefore the body no longer has the disease. No, it's much deeper to see the full connection between the mind and the body. So it's not just belief, it's what our experiences are in our lifetime, how is the way we see the world, we perceive the world. All of these things at a subtle level also influence and represent themselves as the body. So it goes much further than belief. And then as we continue to go deeper into what we are calling mind, we get to this place where mind and body themselves are representations of something fundamental, and that's a different kind of healing. That's a kind of healing of identity, healing of who I am, where do I come from, where am I going, what is this all about? And there's a kind of healing that happens there, after which many of the other burdens that were once burdens are no longer burdens, because of that clarity and depth that sets in. Doesn't mean there's nothing else to do, it doesn't mean there's no more work to do, but it's a kind of healing that goes beyond the body being a certain way or my thoughts being a certain way. So these are the different levels at which mind and healing operate.
So healing isn't necessarily just physical ailments.
No, healing is definitely not only physical ailments. Like, we have our specialty in biomedical science and allopathy in the emergency department in most hospitals. Our specialty is physical medicine, right? And biomedical science is based on, of course, biology. Biology is based on our representation of the human being, which we call anatomy. And our anatomical models are strictly physical. You won't find mind in any anatomical model. So biomedical science, its strength is physical anatomy, physical diagnosis, physical treatment, right? So that has its effect, that has its, let's say, use, especially in emergencies, right? That's why in an acute situation, in an emergent situation, acute trauma, acute blood loss, acute severe infection, emergency medicine is great at this. Our healthcare system is generally great at this. But other kinds of things that aren't acute emergencies, we're not so good at. And we're not good at reversing chronic diseases, for example. So many chronic diseases, but what we do is manage them. And they're oftentimes getting worse over time, sometimes staying stable over time, but rarely reversing them and healing from them. And that is because of this. It's because we're so focused on the physicality, and our training is in the physicality, that we miss what's called the mental aspect of experience. Or sometimes it's just kind of put off in a corner. We say it's lifestyle. And we say, yes, eat your veggies and lifestyle and do all that. But then we revert to the physical system, right? We don't have that in-depth exploration. And on our Healing is Possible podcast, you'll see stories, so-called medical miracles. But I don't use that term. I put them in quotes because a miracle is only something that we don't understand. And the reason we don't understand it is because our model of the human being, the anatomical model, is so incomplete. We're only looking at the physicalized aspect of the human being. And we've assumed a physicalist paradigm, philosophy. And we don't know that we've done that. That philosophy is not part of our training. We've just kind of assumed it without knowing, right? So when we're bringing in what we call mind, which is our experience, right? It's not just something you measure with a lab test or you see with a CAT scan, but when we start to dive into the person's experience, how they're experiencing themselves, what's happening, then we see many so-called miracles, because we're actually seeing more of the person, the whole person. And we have stories of healing from severe Crohn's disease after decades of pain and surgery and hospitalizations, healing from rheumatoid arthritis after being on immunosuppressants and being in severe pain, healing from heart disease because a physician took the extraordinary amount of time it takes to teach them about what to eat. So they reversed their severe heart disease, which was previously unheard of, right? Without surgery, without stents, and being off of all medications, right? And on. Stories of cancer, stories of ulcerative colitis, multiple sclerosis, and on and on. And in every one of these cases, it's because we're not strictly looking at the physical aspect of this person. We're looking at something deeper. So we shouldn't be calling these miracles. We should just be calling these more complete evaluations of the human being. And when that happens, yes, we see all kinds of healings that would otherwise be thought to be not possible.
Mm-hmm. Do you personally work with the patients and show them how to work with the mind?
This is my role here, is communicating about this, communicating about the model, communicating about different ways to see things. I do talk with people about the 3 minds framework and a different way of seeing their current experience. I think there are many ways, many approaches to healing, including what I practice, emergency medicine, allopathic medicine. That's one of the options. And it's important to see all the other perspectives and to know how all of these play a role. So my role is really providing that clarity. And also through Health Revolution, we're offering healing services from people that we've worked with. People can go to the website, healthrevolution.org, and work with these people. We have one person, Kimberly, who's doing something amazing with what she calls a trauma response syndrome, which takes a look at people who have experienced trauma and reframes, or people who have been given certain diagnoses, mental illness diagnoses, and they look at that from a different lens, from having experienced some difficulty from before, and from there arrive at a new way of seeing this and a new way of healing. And she's teaching other therapists to do this. That's just one example. So my role is providing this clarity and this platform and uplifting others who have amazing perspectives that need to be shared. But the critical aspect, recognizing some of the philosophy, some of the direct experience, some of the problems, the limitations that are in the current healthcare system, and how to go forward. Because the goal is to systematize this, right? This isn't about me doing some private consultations or somebody doing something over there. That's already happening. There are tons of people doing amazing work, right, and helping people heal. But there are these pockets here and there. We need to systematize that that can only happen with clarity on the philosophy, clarity on the experience, clarity on the science, clarity on tying all of these together.
Well, how do you bring more awareness, right? Like, how do you have these conversations with doctors who have been traditionally trained, like you have been, and not really necessarily talking about the mind, just looking at the anatomy and the biology of patients? How do you have those conversations with doctors that have, I don't know, how do you teach an old dog new tricks?
Well, it's a person has to be ready. This is not something we force. But one thing is just being honest. Physicians know what's happening. We know what works. And there are some things we do very well in emergency medicine and allopathic medicine in general. There are some things that we really don't do well. And most physicians know this. Every physicians know this, right? We may not say it publicly, but we all know this. And at some point, we have a responsibility to the public to speak up about what works, what the limitations are, and what we can do. And there's been so much talk in this country, as you know, about healthcare reform over 1 or 2 decades or more. It goes back a long time. But one thing we have not talked about as much is upgrading our medical knowledge itself to include a broader perspective on the human being, right? Rather than saying, this is our model of anatomy, we know what the human being is, now let's focus on these parts and how all these parts fit together, how they slide past each other, how they interact with each other. That's one approach. But we need another approach now that says, wait a second, the way we were defining this human being itself was too limiting, right? We need to open that up. And a lot of physicians know that, because without that, what we're doing is looking at a person like a machine. Now, in the United States, the physician suicide rate is twice that of the general population.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that for a moment, right? So people say physicians, the prestige, the money, they have it all. Twice the rate of the general population in terms of suicide. Why is that? And one reason is, short patient visits, right? Increasing amount of work to do for reimbursements, like a lot of paperwork, a lot of things that take other time from actually seeing the person in front of you, right? Always having to be on the computer. These are some of the reasons given, but I think it's actually more fundamental than that. I think what happens is that in training, as we said, we frame the person as a physical thing, as a machine made up of small parts. And it's not intended as derogatory. We're not trying to do it intentionally. It's just naturally the way the culture is developed, the philosophy and the culture is developed, that we see the person as a physical thing. And that's our training. As human beings, we're all human beings, physicians or not, physicians, patients, whoever, we're just human beings. So as human beings, we develop rapport, we develop conversation, we can see each other. But then that training model, the diagnostic model, then focuses us into a physicalized version. And there is that tension in that shift. There's a tension in the shift from just seeing somebody as a person, as a whole person, and now having to squeeze that person into a physical model, especially when the same person comes back week after week with the same thing going on, and the medication isn't helping, and this doesn't work, and that doesn't work, and the bills are piling up. Like, it becomes very obvious, every physician has experienced this, that this approach is not working. And the question is, why? Right? So there are many physicians like that, and innumerable physicians and medical students and residents have contacted me, usually privately through email, and then we'll have a conversation, because there's such a strong culture that says, no, our model is physicalist. I mean, nobody says that literally, but that is the idea, that if you start talking about mind being fundamental, you can talk about wellness, you can talk about mind-body medicine maybe a little bit, but if you talk about mind too much, if you start to say that, well, actually mind could be fundamental, and that doesn't mean that we're making it up, it doesn't mean it's in our head, it just means that there's much more to work with when we start to see mind as fundamental. So that perspective, it's hard to come out in public with that perspective. And so those conversations are usually in private. So to answer your question of how we reach these people, they're reaching out already. And there's so many physician programs that are doing this kind of thing. But again, what we're going to do is establish a platform that brings all of this together, the philosophy, the science, the direct experience, and the application in healthcare and healing.
Are you met with resistance from the healthcare system with this message?
Yes. So on social media, sometimes we can see it, the resistance. When I tweet about what's happening in healthcare, the state of evidence-based medicine, how we need to improve the evidence in evidence-based medicine, these are sacred ideas in healthcare. So when we start to shed light on this and talk about how we need to take this to the next level, then it naturally challenges our sense of identity. It challenges our sense of expertise and authority. So there is pushback that comes. However, there are many, many more people that feel it as a breath of fresh air and that encourage it on social media and privately, especially physicians. It's very gratifying to hear from physicians who say, thank you so much for doing this. It's just like, a breath of fresh air. Or we do private consultations on the 3 minds framework, and their mind is blown at just being able to see the very same experience from a totally different perspective, and to say that these experiences you're having are okay and normal, so-called mystical experiences or different ways of experiencing themselves. So there are far, far, far more people who support this, who are ready for this, who want to understand this. That I should add as a key factor. One thing that scares a lot of people is that they think that this is unscientific or irrational. And if you can label something unscientific or irrational, it makes it okay to ignore it, right? Because then I can be the rational scientific person and that person over there is irrational and unscientific. But if you say, no, actually, this doesn't contradict science. To see a human being like this doesn't contradict science. We can still have the biomedical model. We can still have the molecular model of anatomy. And that can be a way that we represent the human being. It's just not the final way. It's just not the only way, right? We can say that non-local, and we can talk about how that happens. A non-local field differentiates into a polar aspect, right? The perceiver and the perceived. And that perceived aspect takes on the qualities of the perceiver in terms of finitude, which is experienced as points, and then the atomic model, and all of that can fit in there. So it doesn't have to contradict science in any way. What we're simply adding is another view to that. Now, what the implications are for medicine, that generally is not seen. And this is where the fear and the feeling that I'm not standing on solid ground, and what if this is irrational? What if I'm unscientific? All of these questions come up. And that's part of my role, is to say, hey, that's normal. I've been there. So here's a way we can integrate all that, and we can remain on the solid ground of reason and understanding. That's a key factor here. This is not about giving up understanding or giving up reason.
I love that. I think you have a blog post on your website. It was a great question, and I wanted to ask you. I think it was, how do I start the process of spirituality and good health? Right, like a lot of people listening to this interview it's maybe the first time they're hearing of you and your story and your movement, which I think is an accurate question. I think it's an important question. Like, how do we start that process?
To really give a good answer, it has to be to that person, because it is unique. It depends on where a person is and what's happening in their life at this time. To give a broad answer, we talk about the 4 engines of health and healing, which are nutrition, movement, connection, and rest. And starting to attend to all of these can start the process of making the mind more subtle. We talked about that first mind with the constricted boundary. So the first step would be to find ways to relax that boundary, right? Some ways, in some terms, we say shifting into that state of relaxation, which is why there's so much talk about meditation, mindfulness, and all of these activities. And so from the nutrition side, that can happen with switching to a plant-based diet. So more fresh foods, fresh plants, fresh fruits and vegetables, and less processed foods. In the beginning, the key thing is high quality ingredients, even more than plants. So cutting out the processed foods, the added sugar, the added salt, this will have the effect of kind of lightening the mind, right? And of course, there can be cravings, there can be a whole process associated with that. But this is a key thing to understand, is that this can facilitate the process. On the movement side, range of motion of the body. So yeah, if we can exercise, great. But if we can't exercise, then the range of motion, like every single joint, take it through its full range of motion. Because if mind-body flow theory is correct, then what we're saying is the body is the representation of the mind. So by increasing the range of motion of the body, we're actually making the mind also more flexible, right? By taking the body to that point of tension, not spilling over into pain, but that point of tension, and holding it there and then allowing it to stretch a little bit. What we're doing is making that mind more flexible and open. All right, so that's movement. Other very important aspects of movement, moving our ideas, right? What are your ideas as a person? Like, what do you think about A, B, C, D? That needs to come out. That has to be said, even if it's to a journal. Super important, because that it's like a garage. You can think of the mind as a garage. If you have stuff that's stored in there from decades, there's no room to breathe in there. So what you think is super important. It's not about right or wrong. It's about expressing that, learning from that, developing that, moving our emotions. You know, that thing that bothered me from when I was 10 years old, I'm still holding it now. And there's no room in this garage to see around, because it's full of this emotion that hasn't seen the light of day. You know, so knowing that it's okay to cry, knowing that it's okay to be sad. You know, in spirituality, I think one of the most toxic ideas is that you shouldn't be sad. Can't be sad. You got to be smiling all the time. You know, it's a process. So that's nutrition, that's movement. Connection can be meditation or mindfulness, you know, the usual things that we talk about. Connection also with others, having a conversation like we're having. And the third aspect is connection with the planet, which I think is most often overlooked. So bare feet in the grass, you know, bare feet in the sand near the ocean, like your eyes actually looking at the sky. We're so used to looking two-dimensionally in this plane, but actually looking at the sky, laying on your back, looking at the sky. This has effects on the mind. This isn't just, oh, it's a romantic thing to do on a summer day. No, it has an effect on the mind, on the constitution of the mind. So connecting with the planet, obviously fresh air in the lungs. So direct contact with the planet in that sense. And rest, getting enough sleep, and eventually learning how to rest the mind even while awake. That when the mind is not needed, that we can simply set it aside, just like we might say, we might have a cup of coffee, we might take a sip and we say, okay, I'm just going to set it aside here. That's also resting the mind. So these four engines of nutrition, movement, connection, and rest are across the mind, across the body for each one. Nutrition can be this conversation, right? It's nourishing the mind. It's learning a new perspective. So for any person who wants to get started on this, you know, look at which of these appeal to you. Nutrition, movement, connection, and rest. Pick one of all the things I listed, saying, that sounds kind of like interesting. Maybe I want to try that, and try that. And start to go from there. And your life will lead you to what you need to do. Once that interest is there and you start taking that up, it'll take you. And eventually all of these merge: nutrition, movement, connection, and rest. They merge into mind-body flow theory, where once that mind starts to become subtle enough and that body loosens up enough, massage is another great one for movement, by the way, to move those muscles. We can do our own range of motion, but also getting a massage and loosening those muscles. So once these four are done enough and that mind becomes subtle, then mind-body flow theory is no longer intellectual. It becomes experiential. we start to experience that there's no divide actually between what we call a body and what we call a mind. That there's simply this streaming experience of identity, of living. So this is one way to get started.
There's also a quote, I think, on your website. I want to respect your time, and this is probably the last one, but I'm definitely going to have you back because I think your content is just so powerful. The world is seen and felt as imagination. Can you dive into that for me?
This is a second mind perspective. And as I start this, I also want to say it doesn't mean that the world is not important. It doesn't mean that the world is not real. To me, imagination is real. I was just talking to somebody else about this yesterday. When we say, well, I imagined this happened, that's real. It's real imagination, right? It's not that I imagined that, oh, but that was imaginary. It doesn't matter. No. It happened. It's significant. It has meaning. And so it's real. The whole idea, the misconception of real comes from our false division of physical and mental. And once you divide physical and mental, then you start to say physical is real because we share it in our experience, and mental is not real. But again, that is a first mind view. It's just a way of seeing. It's not the truth. It's a kind of truth that we can experience. So when we say the world is experienced as imagination, this is a second mind perspective in which it's not that I, Anoop, or I, Trey, am imagining the world, but it's that I, the sense of identity, the sense of personality, the sense of the body, the sense of the world is imaginational in nature. The very sense of localization, of being a person, a thing in a place with a storyline, is imaginational and real. It's not, it's imaginational, therefore it's unimportant. It's not, it's imaginational, therefore forget about it. It's not imaginational, therefore transcend it. You know, like grow up, be a spiritual master. It's not any of those things. It's that it's luminous and magical and imaginational and powerful and real. And it's another way of navigating the life experience.
Anoop, I can't thank you enough for joining. How can people find you? How can they find out more about your content, about your books? Where can they buy your books?
The books are on Amazon. The first book was Michelangelo's Medicine, where I talked about my journey through my training in residency and how that started to, inform what I'm doing now. And the second book is This a Dream, which is more of a series of reflections that can jumpstart the mind to start seeing other perspectives. The website is healthrevolution.org. We are building a complete ecosystem for healing, step by step, starting with the Healing is Possible podcast. It's on YouTube. And then the audio podcast is on Google, Apple, Spotify. And so you can check that out. We have an episode coming out every Saturday of just literally talking to people who are healing in ways that are thought to be not possible. And what we're seeing is this is commonplace, but we're not telling the stories, so we don't know it. Right? So that's the Healing is Possible podcast. The other thing that we recently started is the Science of Healing live stream. So we live stream Wednesday nights, 9 p.m. Eastern time. First one was yesterday at 9 p.m. It's now on the website. And this is really a meditative inquiry. When we say the science of healing, we talk about science, we usually think of it as conceptual, right? We have these concepts that we have to break down and understand. And that's one way to think about it. And then when we talk about healing and spirituality, many times it's meditation, right? It's sit down, quiet the mind, and be in silence, and then that's the way to go. And what we're doing is creating this middle ground called Meditative Inquiry. And this is where we relax the mind and start to enter a meditative state, but we keep our reasoning, right? We keep our rationality, we keep our curiosity, and we start to reconcile these two worlds, the logical linear world and the creative imaginational world. And we bring these two and we start to explore. So in the recent episode, we talked about context and content, and we talked about the importance of the mind and the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. But as important as all of that was that we did it through meditative inquiry. So we did a 15-minute meditation where we started to experience what these words mean, what these concepts mean. And that makes all the difference in the world, because then we can use our logic, we can use our reason, we can use our rationality, and we can now codify these experiences that were otherwise thought to be really nebulous, and we can start to make that bridge. So that's what the Science of Healing live stream is about. So anybody who's interested, join us Wednesdays at 9 p.m. and we'll be rolling out more stuff as it happens.
I'm excited for that. Next time you come on, we're going to have to do a meditation. You'll have to lead us in a meditation.
Sure.
But I can't thank you enough for taking the time and just coming on. Like I really didn't want to comment too much. I usually talk quite a bit. But I wanted to listen to your point of view and listen to your concepts and your experience. And I can't thank you for actually doing the work and putting this out there and trying to change this paradigm. So thank you.
Thank you, Trey.